Thanks to everyone for being here tonight as we round out the final Michael Crowley Lecture 2018-19 series. It's been, I think this year, especially a enjoyable journey, starting out with Christine Keneally and then going to Tom Foley with the Emmett Guards, and then on to Brendan O'Malley next, and Dr. Lucy Salyer with the immigration, the Irish immigration stories and the Fenians. And then tonight for Cormac O'Malley. And before I introduce him, a couple admin notes. Please turn off any cell phones, anything that's electronic in here. It does interfere with the recording of the sound system. So I'll hold on a minute. As we're looking ahead for the summer, keep in mind a couple of things coming up. Steak fry on 8 June, is that Saturday, 8 June? And then the gala on Saturday, 17 August, so mark your calendars. Saturday, 17 August, Rotunda, Easton's Beach. Please. We will throw in there somewhere, it is 8, right, Kathleen? Okay. Somewhere, we are likely going to have one other social event I'm working on right now. It may be, and this is being worked, it may be a bus trip to the Maritime Museum over in Fall River, and maybe get out of our comfort zone and go to a Portuguese restaurant somewhere. That's being worked right now. Tonight I'm going to connect a couple dots here, which I don't think I've done before, but it ties into the presenter tonight. And that is, as many of you know, I grew up in Worcester, Mass. In an area called Tatnick on the west side. We were a close-knit group of people, and there were 5 families that to this day we still get together. We've been together since kindergarten, in one case 3rd grade, but all the way through college. And all of our families, all of our children, know all the other families' children and still connect with them and get together with them. None of us live in Worcester. Back of me, so close that we could yell at each other when we joke about it. When we were grounded and we couldn't come out of the house, I could still yell at Brian Kennedy. And the Kennedys they moved in when he was in 3rd grade, and they had Brendan, Maura, Sean, and Brian. And Brian's my lifelong friend here, and you can wave, Brian, and he married Frances O'Driscoll, sitting right next to him. She's from Ennis County, Clare. Now, here's where we're going with this, okay? Brian's sister Maura older sister Maura went to Albertus Magnus. And after that, I don't think I ever saw her again. She went off to Manhattan, where as I'm told, during a St. Patrick's Day party that she was hosting, she met the love of her life, Cormac O'Malley, who whisked her off. And they lived around the world in places like Mexico, Brussels, New York, amongst a few others. And they finally ended up residing in Stonington, Connecticut, just down the road. But I hadn't seen her, and for 40 years they traveled the globe as he practiced international law. Then ended up in Stonington, as I said, and we connected via email when he had a lecture series going on down in Stonington and invited some of us down there, and we could not make the connection at that time. 4 years ago, going through Kilmainham Jail in Dublin with my cousins, introducing them to Kilmainham Jail. At the end of the tour, the docent said, and oh, by the way, I want to show you the route that Ernie O'Malley took. He's the only one to ever escape from Kilmainham Jail, and he did it not once but twice. And the person that was there said, here is the route that we believe he took. Because the question was, how could he ever get out of here? Spent time doing that, and that's when I realized, it clicked that that was Cormac's father. His dad escaped twice, and when you finish the tour at Kilmainham Jail, They have an artifact room there, and in the artifact room is a bust, a very nice bust of Ernie O'Malley, Cormac's dad. So that's connecting the dots. And he's with us tonight. He's a graduate of Harvard College. He was a veteran of the United States Navy. He's a graduate of Columbia Law School, and as I said, he practiced international law for over 40 years. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Cormac O'Malley.
Can I just test audience on the back row? Can you hear me? Do I need this? Dan, do I need this for your recording or first Dan?
Always.
Do I need this for you?
I think just in general.
In general. Okay. And do I need to turn it on? There's no lights. Can you hear me? You come up here.
Test. All right.
Dan, you can take over. Well, look, welcome. Let me see. How long do you want me to talk for? Oh, well, I have to hold this too. Okay, it's complex, you know. These are things that they don't teach you in graduate school. Anyway, well, look, welcome. I'm actually from Newport, a different country and a different county. But anyways, welcome to, and I hope that there's a greater relationship between Newport here and Newport County Mayo, and we'll talk about that later. Anyway, all I need is a bottle and we can spin it. So look, my father's life comes in two parts. Actually, it's a very sad story, as you'll find out by the end. The first half is the military part, and the second half is his personal part. And the military was a failure, given the fact that Ireland never really got its freedom. Though there was a treaty, and we'll go into all of that, etc. And you can see there's some after effects still going on in Northern Ireland, and some horrors going on. But and the second half of his life was also one which didn't work out the way that the ideal plans of happy married life and children prospering and all of his own enterprises just really never flourished in the way that he wanted. But I'll explain that later. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is, here he was, taken a photograph in 1933 by my mother, who's an American artist, and you'll get to meet later in the second half of the story. So I'll be covering basically his life, his childhood in the West, his travels, and then when he comes back to Ireland in 1935. So his life is really divided into two major segments. The military, and then a little travel, and then when he comes back to Ireland in 1935. So showing where he wrote about this in a book I'll be mentioning, On Another Man's Wound. And this is the town in which he was raised, in Castlebar, not too far where I was raised in Newport. 1890, he was born in 1897. But you know, it's still a dirt road and carts on the street, and long before motor cars came, his father had lived in a very nice house on that main street, and when they moved to Dublin, they also had a very nice house. Here's what we in the family called the Ma, and she was a curate from Roscommon, and my grandfather here was a solicitor's clerk. And it's extraordinary when you think of, we all imagine what a solicitor's clerk would be in any level of society. But in those days, days as solicitor's clerk could in fact get a reasonable salary and would be highly respected because they'd be working for one of the only several solicitors in the town. And he would be recognized by the parish priest, of course, that would be very helpful, and by the policeman, because he would be a person of substance, even though not wealth, because of his position. Anyway, stern-looking fellow. I never met him. He died in 45. I probably did meet him. I sat on his knee, no doubt, but I never heard, I never really knew him. So, my father was raised in Castlebar, and in the summertime, Castlebar is about 12 miles from Westport. In the summertime, they would go over to Westport, they'd rent a house, and believe it or not, the trains were running in those days, and on time. And my grandfather could take a train from Westport to Castlebar, go to work, and in the afternoon, the return train from Dublin was coming through, he'd pick it up in Castlebar and go back to town. So it was a long, otherwise you were left walking or taking a pony and trap. But he was a clerk in the office of Mulcahy Kelly. Mulcahy Kelly became quite a distinguished person because he moved in to be the Solicitor-General of Ireland. First of all, Solicitor General of County Mayo, which is a sort of senior post. He took Mr. Malley. Our family name is Malley, not O'Malley. And this happens in many Irish societies. I met some Sullivans tonight. All I say to them, don't forget the O'Sullivans, because they're all part of the same clan. And O would mean grandfather's group, and Mac would mean son of. So just for those who aren't aware of those little subtleties. So whether you put the O in your name or not is not really very relevant. Sometimes you were put down on the farm, so to speak, by your neighbors or by your landlord, and you were told to eliminate the O. That's one version of history. Another is simply that Malia would be the Irish name, and you wouldn't need the O in front of O'Malley. So if you look up any of the Irish records of the 19th century, you'll see Malia and Malley, and sometimes O'Malley and O'Malley. Doesn't really make too much difference. Anyway, so father was raised in a spirit. These were at a low level of, not a low level of society, but a clerk's level of society. Very much pro-establishment. So when the issues of home rule came, which was trying to bring the Irish government back to its rightful place, which would be in Ireland, they were not particularly in favor of it, or swung one way or the other. Would be a good idea, but they certainly wouldn't have been what my father referred to have any national faith. National faith would be on the more physical side of history, the people who wanted to physically force the issue to make sure that it wasn't necessarily done in the slow process of constitutionalism, which already took 100 years to get 120 years to get the Parliament back to Dublin, and they wanted to force that issue, which is the whole reason that 1916 comes up. Anyway, and he also referred to, and you can see in the attitude of the words that he picked here to describe Castlebar, which would be, Castlebar was a county capital, a fairly big town in terms of local towns in Ireland, but he called, ours was a Shawneen town. Shawneen meaning a little John Bull who aped the manners and fashions of the English. And that's what the capital towns of any of the Irish counties would have been, compared to, let's say, Newport, which would be far more, even in the modern days, Republican than the establishment in Castlebar. One of the biggest influences on my father during his childhood was, and these parents, you can see, they had 11 siblings, so they had, so to speak, a lot to do, but in fact they delegated, as one could in those days, very easily, because even on a clerk's salary you could afford to have one or two helpers living in the house. And there was, grandfather had a pony and trap, someone had to take care of that. So again, on a very relatively low level of income, you were able to have a significant, pleasant status of life. Mary Ann Jordan, the nanny in the house for the first 5 children, was a great storyteller, and father remembered these, and that was really how he got into learning the Irish culture. It wasn't from his parents. He never learned Irish, even though she was a Gaeilgeoir speaking Irish. They probably discouraged that practice. But what he picked up from her was the great stories, themes, and they appear throughout his books in his later life, in his poetry, in his memoirs, and in his essays. And it feeds into the stream of nationalism. So he sort of, I sort of think of it, he receives nationalism from his nanny rather than from his mother. And she would have said, no doubt, something like what he later wrote, which is, he felt that the inward hate of things English, which I expect all Irishmen inherit. The king was my objective. I hated and blamed him. And in his biography, he does say that whenever when he was at school in Dublin, he spelled king with a small k. Now the family, it's interesting, the way I explain the family is that they moved to Dublin in 1906, but there were really 3 levels of the family. The first sort of 5 children, well, the first 4 children, unfortunately in Ireland, quite often the girl gets left aside. We all know that. But Frank and his brother Albert go off to join the British Army. They get out of school in Dublin in 1914, and there's unemployment. And suddenly this big employer in the British Army comes. There is no national spirit in them. They haven't joined the Irish Volunteers. They don't know anything about that. They just want to get a good job. And they go off and fight the Hun on the continent. And they end up going to Africa subsequently and dying in Africa rather than returning to Ireland, where of course they would be wearing a British uniform. And the Ma thought that was not a good idea and told them to stay out of Ireland. So father is in that group along with Marion. Marion and Kathleen become a nurse. That's what the mother did, and she saw her way. Again, it's a great way to not only a profession, but also you can supervise and get jobs, as the two children, Marion and Kathleen, did. Then you jump over the next layer: Cecil, Charlie, Paddy, and Kevin. Well, they were all young enough to follow not their brothers who went to the British Army, but they had this rebel living amongst them, my father, who was at university, and as you'll see here shortly, they followed him into the IRA. The next generation, which comes down some years later, born 1912, is Brendan and Desi. Both of them join in the British Army in the Second World War. So again, this is the typical mixed-up Irish family, intergenerational in a certain sense. I mean, these people barely met those people because they were out of the house. Desi's born in 1918, never met his brothers. So, that's when you do over a spread of 22 years, really. So the point about the experience in the West is that he had these memories throughout from the folklore days, and he writes about them in his poems. He's always interested in folklore. Whatever you'll hear later, that he goes to Arizona, he goes to New Mexico, he goes to Mexico, he goes to the Pyrenees. He's absorbing he had an incredible sort of brain that could remember all of the levels of society that he met. And so he wrote about them. Damn it, because I'm now trying to read his handwriting. And one of these days I'll publish his book on County Mayo folklore. So 1916 comes up. They've moved to Dublin. He goes into university, gets a scholarship. So in a certain sense, Ernie O'Malley does not have to make a decision like his brothers as to what to do in 1914. First of all, he hasn't graduated yet. 1915, the war is going on, and he flunks out of the senior year, but somehow he hears that there's a scholarship available. He takes the exam and he sits it, and he wins a seat to the University College Dublin. He goes into medicine. So he's happily there in the fall of 1915. He has not joined the Irish Volunteers. There is fun made at home about all of the volunteers. You know, by 1915, the guns have been landed in Hull, and the Irish Volunteers have been marching up and down the street. And all my father hears is the family laughing at nationalism. And so he is, in that sense, relatively conservative. Now, what happens, and this is sort of one of the ironies in family life, you might all know of the name of Major John McBride. He's one of the 16 men executed. He's from County Mayo. He knows the Malley family. They occasionally have Sunday lunch. And he comes in and shortly before Easter Sunday and is having lunch with the Malleys and turns around to my father and sort of says, well, what are you going to do when you grow up, so to speak? And he says, well, you know, maybe I'll join the British Army. So even in 1916, just before the outbreak of the Easter Rebellion, you can see that he has not made a commitment one way or the other. So that day on 1916, it would be April 24th, it's a bank holiday Monday. He's down and downtown Dublin, and he reads the Proclamation of Independence with the glorious words which say, you know, Ireland, the land of Ireland should be for the Irish. It's a very simple concept. I mean, looking back on it now, we sort of say, why should that move somebody? But you have to think of the social context in which he grew up, which was, you know, whoever owns the land, that's fine. And my grandfather's job was, working for the British Congested District Board, was to help, with a liberal attitude from the British government, to give Ireland back to the Irish. But excuse me, that was giving land back, but in fact you had to buy your own land. So part of the revolution was all about, why should we buy our own land? This is our land. This is where we're from. This is what was taken from us. You know, and you think of the famine and how people have suffered. That's all because of the system of imperialism, which was imposed on Ireland from somebody else. It wasn't an Irish ideal. So he really became struck by those words in the proclamation. And later, he sort of introduces his own attitude to how he got into that position. And he says, my attitude toward the fight was that of a sheltered individual drawn from the secure seclusion of Irish life to the responsibility of action. I'd like to say, I love his words, responsibility of action, because that applies to us all, even today, that we have to take responsibility for action within our own community. And so you hear the story of sort of relatively sleepy, smart, but inept in terms of nationalism, fellow being woken up by words. And what does he do? He takes action. And the action which he takes is, that night he climbs out of his parents' room, goes down, meets a friend, gets a gun, and starts shooting at the British soldiers. Now, they were a long way down the pier, the bombardment was just starting, and yet, with the sense of the future, of what the responsibility for action was, he did that. And for the next next 2 years, He climbed out of the window every night after his studies and had dinner with the O'Malley family. He joined the Irish Volunteers. He participated while still at the university in learning Irish, going to the Kiwis, learning how to dance. He wasn't very good at the dancing, I hear. But anyway, just learning the steps and doing the various things that... And these were people who were trying to become Irish. They hadn't recognized, just because you're born in a place, that... Yeah, and there were several cultures in all of our communities. There are several cultures going on at any one time. Theirs would have been a conservative culture. And so suddenly he was trying to get into what his nanny had told him about, what the Irishness was. And he was trying to suddenly learn that culture, which he hadn't read about before. Anyway, so when you think of his next couple of years, so he joins the IRA in late 1916, and he gets out of prison in 1924. And reflecting on those years, he later said that the work for some of us was a kind of crusade in which you first left your home, left your friends, then your social environment and the amenities. One had to stop one's reading of literature, prevent oneself from making friends, as that meant obligations. You traveled in your own narrow circle, sort of nationalist circle. It is difficult to readjust, and then to have the physical and mental complications. It's what I call tough. We have another word for it today. It's called PS, post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's literally eight years on the run was what he was living with. And by the time he got out of it, he was a wreck. He really was a wreck. And that was sort of, he tries to recover that, as I described later. Anyway, when he went on the run in March 1918, I always thought that made a big decision. He's going to go on the run. After I've done a little research, I find out that in fact he flunked his medical exams. And time to move on. You could then ask, well, why did he flunk his medical exams? He was spending a lot of time in the nationalist cause, so he wasn't studying what he should be studying, so he didn't. And medicine is a gruesome activity to go through. I've seen some of his notebooks, and law was much easier, I can say that. Anyway, so he gave up on that, and he went. He was already a volunteer. He went down, and guess what? One thinks of the IRA as being a significant organization. In fact, in those days, it was not a significant organization. It's very small, because there weren't too many people on the staff. There were people organized down the country. But when Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy were organizing things in Dublin, when a volunteer walks in and sort of says, I'm here to report, they're just very happy, because there's only 4 or 5 other people in the headquarters. So what Father was given is a tremendous sense of responsibility by going to organize brigades all around Dublin, Ireland. And you can see marked in the map here the areas where he went, from the Donegal down to, he never got down to Cork and Kerry, but there were 18 different brigades that he went through. And part of what he needed to do in each of those areas that he went to is, without being given much direction, he would say, go down and meet the local commander, assess what was needed in a local area, bring some books and try to get them to march up and down, get a sense of discipline. That sounds easy to describe, but can you imagine a young university student, someone really looking young, and also you know that he comes from Dublin, and he has a Dublin accent by this time, and he's gone to university, trying to tell Irish farmers what to do? Wow, if you want a difficult assignment. And one of the things Father does write about later on in 1920s, because he's really getting tough on people, and he'd had experience by that time. He says, You know, the family would prefer to have the RIC come into the house because he knows what those people do. Namely, they look at you, and if they think you're guilty or whatever, they might take you off, but you only lose one son. If Ernie O'Malley comes into your house, he's going to take all the sons. Who's going to milk the cows? Who's going to cut the thing? And you know, you go. They would parade at, guess what time in the evening they would parade? 10:30 and 11 o'clock at night. Well, I don't know how many of you are farmers, but you know the cows need milking in the morning. So, I mean, this is a very practical thing. And so the implication of having Ernie O'Malley come into your house had significant social impact, because you knew a revolution was coming into your house. Someone who could influence your sons. And you know, the father had now perhaps gotten his land, everything was nice and happy, he was married, had 2 or 3 children, and the future would be, you know, rosy or at least reasonable. But there would be no great upset in your life. And to have a revolutionary come into, well, revolutionary, that's what the whole thing was about. Come in and organize your children. You're putting your children at risk. So this guy isn't a great friend of yours. He's someone who's going to challenge you about everything that you've done in your life up to that point. And it's certainly true. And look where he was. Tyrone, Offaly, all across Ireland, year by year. He reported back to Collins, did things. He went over to London. The reason that Michael Collins heard of him, actually, this is an interesting story. The brother, his older brother, had been wounded, came back for convalescence. Guess what uniform he had on? A British uniform. And guess what Ernie O'Malley needed? Well, he needed a gun. I mean, everyone wants a gun, particularly if you're in a volunteer organization which is looking for a gun. So he took his, and where would you get guns? How about a police station? Well, how about Dublin Castle, where they run all of Ireland, so to speak? They must have guns. So he puts on his brother's uniform as an Irish volunteer, puts on his British brother's officer's uniform, goes down into Dublin Castle, knocks on the door, and says, "Where do I get a permit?" "Over there, sir." He goes into the permit and says, "Oh, I'm just back from the front. Oh, this stuff is going on. I need a pistol to protect myself." "Oh, absolutely, sir. Yes, I know. Well, just sign here, and how many rounds would you be wanting?" 400 anyway, you know, just saying, this is going to go on for it. So Dublin Castle issues to Ernie O'Malley a pistol, and he walks out of Dublin Castle with a pistol. So that story leaked around. And so here is responsibility for action. I mean, he's thinking what he should do as a nationalist as to how to solve his own problem. Number one, how to get a gun. And he comes up with a solution. And he gets away with it. So he is ready for action in the sense that he's willing to put, he's unmarried, he doesn't have children. Many of the 1916 people were married and had children. And they, notwithstanding those responsibilities, they put nation ahead of life. Father was in a position where he didn't have those responsibilities, but he still had the same attitude, which was, we need to do something, and the only way to do something is to show other people that you have a commitment. And so, as he went around that country in that map, you could see that in many of these areas, part of the responsibility that he did is he would get the local people to do what I call raids and rallies. So there'd be local RIC barracks that you go up, tap on the roof, and pour the petrol in, and get yourself burned. In the meantime, finally the RIC would wave the flag and come out and leave their guns and sort of run away. And the IRA would say to them, just don't come, they would take the list of names and addresses and say, don't come back here, or you know what will happen. Unlike what the British did to volunteers. Anyway, so just to continue on the story, what happens here is he, one of his assignments is to go down to Kilkenny, and unfortunately what happens in Kilkenny is that he gets captured. problem there was he would get captured with his grenades, with his guns, with his maps. It was quite clearly that he was sent down there to attack a major British installation. So he was almost shot in Kilkenny by the people who picked him up. They didn't know what to do with him, but somebody sort of said, well, send him up to Dublin Castle. So they went up to Dublin Castle, where they had experts who'd been well trained during the First World War as to how to get information out of people. We call that torture. Anyway, by the time he got banged up and bullied around, bayoneted, had his feet trampled on with hobnail shoes, he was in pretty bad state. They didn't get anything out of this young farmer called Bernard Stewart. They had an alias. And so he looked so young at 23. By the time he was bruised and battered, he was quite unrecognizable. And so they said, well, maybe this is a mistake. He just must have been an underling when he was down in Kilkenny. And they threw him out to Kilmainham jail. Well, as Michael said, when he got out to Kilmainham jail, he managed to pull off an escape up there. And there is that gate in Kilmainham jail called the O'Malley Gate. If there's any questions about it, I can explain that, because it's a very exciting story. Anyway, when he got out of Kilmainham, Michael Collins then appointed him to have an area in Mayo, which, because of the lack of organization within the IRA, they had a very unstructured position where they had 65 brigades. 65! So, I mean, any of you have had corporate life or any other type of life teaching, 65 teachers reporting to one person without any departments? It's crazy. So what the IRA did is, in 1921, they developed a system of structure for divisions. And they divided Ireland into 12 divisions. And they gave this young man, at age 23, one of those divisions. It's 7,000 people reporting to him, again by brigades, and the structure would be sectioned into a company into a battalion into a brigade, and then he had 5 brigades reporting to him. So he was dealing at the top level of each of those brigades. So that was his area of responsibility. Anyway, he made it a very effective officer of the 2nd Southern Division. And as I said, 7,000 people. Had a lot of people doing raisin rallies on the various British activities. Michael mentioned Kilmainham Jail. This is the entrance to Kilmainham Jail, and that's the monk shop of Ernie O'Malley, or alias Bernard Stewart. And this was the jail wall of Kilmainham. It's about 30 feet high, and an awesome sight when you look at it. And no one had ever escaped in the last 200 years. So it was quite a feat to get out of there, and again I can respond to what happened. So now we're on to the slippery slope of having gotten out, Michael Collins and others in the not only the political side of the Sinn Féin, but also on the military side, make a decision that we're not winning this war. So there is a historical debate as to whether the IRA were winning the war or not. And it comes down to two sides. Those who go against the treaty, which is signed 6 months later in London, become the anti-treaty Republicans. And they, of course, would assess and say, we were ready, we were winning the war. That's why the British were willing to concede. We wanted to continue this struggle, and we were winning. People like Michael Collins and others who, I'm not saying they knew better, but they knew more in terms of the strength of ammunition, the number of guns that were available to the troops, and they, having had those activities, where would the next ammunition barge come in? It was very hard to get ammunition for the guns, and you get new guns. And Remember also the development in the military tactics, that the machine guns were coming in, armored cars were coming in, going into the Civil War. The British were able to supply the established Irish Army and the Free State Army with all of these materials. The Republicans never got them. So what Collins made a decision, along with other political people, that time to make a break. We've really had success. Let's talk truce, and then let's talk treaty. So that's sort of what happens up through from July to December 1921. A treaty is then signed. It's accepted by the cabinet. You know, I mean, the cabinet is running the country, so to speak, nominally. And then you go to the next layer of democracy, would be the parliament, the Dáil. Well, the treaty was accepted by the cabinet, 4-3. It was accepted by the Dáil, 64 to 57. So again, democratically, you would say it should have been accepted by the people. And then it was put to a vote by the people in a very convoluted way, but because how do you really, it wasn't do you approve this treaty, it was who do you want to elect to Parliament, and those people elected to Parliament were saying we're pro-treaty or anti-treaty. But anyway, in a democratic analysis, one could say probably that 60% of people were pro-treaty and under 40% were anti-treaty. In terms of the geography of who was on what side, Dublin being the capital, and all of these divisions were around Dublin on the outskirts, there were 12 Commandant-Generals. So Michael Collins was sitting in Dublin with his Commandant-Generals, and he was, needless to say, as corporate life somehow happens, you happen to agree with your president or your boss. And so the staff people here went pro-treaty. If you look again at the map of where the fighting had gone on, where people's mentality was, we're winning, those people were all anti-treaty at the senior level of the division. So it's you know, you can see historic maps with the map of Ireland being green and this being a different color in a certain sense. So it was very important when you try to figure out what people were going to do and what their attitude after having had this debate in early 1922. There was a split going on in the middle of the IRA. So you're talking about the army, which is now controlling Ireland, so to speak. Suddenly, one commanding officer finds out that several brigades have elected a new commanding officer who is anti-treaty or pro-treaty. So basically, every division within Ireland is splitting, sadly enough. And they pick Ernie O'Malley to be the director of organization. And guess what? Because he's the only one within this group who's worked in so many counties. So they come in and then they need a place to work. So they say, well, in 1916, we took over these great buildings in Dublin, the GPO, the Four Courts, various other places. So the IRA take over the Four Courts as their headquarters. And that becomes quite an issue. Churchill says to Mr. Collins, wait, your Four Courts has been taken over by your opposition and you can't solve this problem? What are you doing? Then things escalate. My father has a great idea. He said, well, why don't we kidnap one of the generals on the Free State side? Okay, and they kidnap Ginger O'Connell and they bring him into the Four Courts. And guess what Mr. Churchill says to Mr. Collins? I mean, history is very personal when you tell it this way. Collins is brought over to London and says, what's going on in Dublin? The Four Courts have been taken over, so there's no law in Ireland. You are lawless. Not exactly, but, you know, symbolically. And secondly, your number two in your army is kidnapped. And he's brought into the Four Courts, sitting down for dinner with the other fellows, but tied up and all of that. he said, this is totally unacceptable. So he says to Mr. Collins, I have General Macready, who was sitting in the room next to them, opened the door and the general walked in. General Macready is the British Army general in charge of the British Army in Ireland. And Collins is given an ultimatum. Are you going to shoot and clear the four courts, or do you want Mr. General Macready to do it? And Collins steps up and says, I'll do it, I'm responsible, I'm the man, I'm your man, Mr. Churchill. And Churchill at that time was the secretary, colonial secretary in charge of running the world, in effect, including the Dominion of Ireland. And so the forecourt starts, and Father is in the forecourts and ultimately surrenders the forecourts and manages to escape again. Whereas all of the senior managers of the IRA refused to leave the forecourts because it might look bad on their resume, on their whatever, that they've withdrawn from their headquarters. And Father's trying to kick them out and say, go to the countryside, go underground, survive. Something like that could have happened. In fact, it did. Guess what? Yeah, that's just a clue. The British bombed. They bombed the forecourts. And the roof fell in. And eventually, they had to surrender. So what happened was, Father managed to escape. And let's say in the management of the IRA there were 20 senior officers. The number one had been fired by the other 20 about 2 weeks before. Liam Lynch had to go down the country because he wasn't sufficiently anti-treaty. And by the time he had finished some negotiations with the Free State, those people who were feeling more pro-Free State, he was barred from his own headquarters, who by that time, which is about 30 minutes after they had left, they elected a new Commandant-General, Mulcahy, from Belfast, and he too was captured. So there was only Liam Lynch, who had been exiled from the Republican cause, and my father, who happened to escape, miraculously, for the second time in his life, and he got out. So Liam Lynch is Chief of Staff of the Anti-Treaty IRA, and Ernie O'Malley suddenly is promoted over the ranks of all of the other people, because he's the only one who hasn't been captured, to be Assistant Chief of Staff of the IRA. And so, at a very young age, still pretty young, he's 24, he becomes number 2 running the Republican cause in the Civil War. It's a disaster for the Republicans. They don't know how to fight. I've been talking to some people recently in Dublin, as you know, we all revere those who tried. And my question to those who are trying to commemorate the Civil War would be, how can you adequately describe people who tried hard, who were very earnest, who believe that the reason that the Civil War was created was they fought for 32 counties, and yet they only got 26 in the treaty. They fought to keep all of their ports, and yet the treaty gave the ports of Ireland away, so that in case of a war, which was going to come up in the Second World War, the British would have had the Irish ports. The IRA said no. So, and thirdly, the big important thing was, and you have to take an oath of allegiance to a foreign king. No, the IRA says we've been fighting for 2 years without a king. Now, we don't do that. Anyway, they lose out all the way around. Father ultimately is, by November, he's trying to fight a war before email, and he's stuck in the second room of a house in Aylesbury Road, Falls Bridge. How do you run a war? Being afraid to go outside lest you be captured. Your troops are reporting in, sorry, no men to file the reports that you've asked for, sir. Do I file a report, or do I go out and take the action that you want me to do? Liam Lynch is writing to Ernie O'Malley. He said, well, why don't we shoot the editors of the newspapers? And Father very politely sort of said, well, I'll write them a letter. And indeed, he doesn't go out and shoot them. He writes letters, gets a response. Because the newspapers, they become important later on while it comes to America, because the newspapers are the source of information that people are reading. And you start developing attitudes as a result of what is said in the newspaper. You don't know whether it's right or wrong, you sort of believe what it is that is said. And anyway, he allowed the editors not to be killed, I have in a book I wrote, the No Surrender Here, you get the story from the editors, which is the reason we have to use these words like irregular was the censor from the Free State wouldn't allow us to publish our newspaper unless we use the words which they permit. So he was explaining in their own way that they were caught in their own bind as to what obligation they had to state. Anyway, he tried and failed in the Civil War. He was eventually captured in November 1922. His body was quite riddled. He had 9 bullets in his body, hopelessly outnumbered in the event when he was captured. Carried off on a trolley and brought to jail, where he was about to be shot. It was an offense under the Free State, and quite naturally so, that if you had a gun and were caught in a battle, you could be automatically executed after a quick trial. That's the way things work when you have civil wars. And so the reason that I'm here today is because Sean Connolly was executed in 1916 because he could not stand trial. He couldn't physically stand up to be shot. He was shot on a board in a chair. So to stand trial actually means to be able to stand up. That means that you're physically fit enough to be stand trial. Just a technical expression, but it has a physical understanding. And so, to the extent that Fowler was still riddled with bullets and unable to stand, very thoughtfully, his medical school classmate, Matthew O'Connell, signed this little statement every day, subject, not ready to stand trial. It actually just said he was physical condition, unfit to stand trial. And Fowler would never speak to Dr. O'Connell again because he wanted to be shot, of course. Because he thought being shot would have the impact of 1916 executions, and therefore, he had no obligations, personal obligations to family at that time. And so if he, no doubt, I'm only conjecturing here, he thought that his death, being a senior military official, would wake people up and sort of say, this can't go on, we must do something. We must come together and compromise. So he was putting his life on the stake in order that other people might be able to survive. As it turns out, he wasn't shot, thus I am. Anyway, the Civil War goes on, 1923. There's no compromise made, but the Republicans, after the death of Liam Lynch in April 11, 1923, the IRA are able to turn their machinery around, so they asked for peace within 4 weeks of his death. Now, that was because the vote 3 weeks before, when Liam Lynch was still Commander-in-Chief, the vote was 5-4 not to talk peace. The vote after he is shot and someone else is appointed to replace him becomes 5-4 to sue for peace. And so the Republicans readily agreed to ceasefire and dump arms. Now technically there's no end to the Civil War. Within the 12-month period after that, there are still 77 Republicans executed. They always remember that number. But basically, those who are, and by that time, there are 14,000 Republicans in jail. 14,000. So I don't know how many of your ancestors, the fathers or grandfathers, came over in the 20s. But if they had been on the Republican side, when they got out of jail, they had no jobs to go to, and so many of them emigrated to various cities around America. Now, in the meantime, Father is still is elected to the Dáil for North Dublin. He goes on a 43-day hunger strike. He's still not able to get out of bed, but he goes on a 41-day hunger strike. They all felt that that was longer than St. Patrick, so they felt very good. And other big name people. They tried to create publicity in his behavior. Ernie O'Malley, TD, means member of the Dáil, sinking fast. If you wish that Ernie O'Malley, Ireland's bravest soldier, should die, take action. So he doesn't die. He gets put back into prison for another 9 months. And at the end of this time, he reflects in his book, his memoir, on the period called The Singing Flame. We who have been beaten in the fight, who withstood the jail war, parted to take up threads of inscrutable destiny, some to begin life all over again. So in fact, once you get out of jail, those 14 people who got out of jail, they had their families. I'm sure the welcoming home might be, well, by some of those people, where the hell have you been, Paddy? But they'd be sympathetic. And maybe the younger son had now gotten the farm. What are you going to do, Paddy? The Free State soldiers had been demobbed by 1924, so they were able to get the first jobs in the town that were available. And of course, they had the creditworthiness from. And remember these, the Republicans, like my father, had been excommunicated by the church twice. And so, both in the Tan War as well as in the Civil War. So, there was no parish priest to stand up for them. There was no professional people who could stand up for them. So, the boat was the answer. Anyway, in my father's case, by the time he got through his getting out of jail, he was in terrible condition. And so he decided to go abroad to improve his health. Because his feet had been trampled on, though he hadn't complained too much, he actually couldn't walk very well. And when he got to the Pyrenees, in Barcelona, he found a little cobbler who could make a shoe for him. And with those shoes, he was able to obviously do exercise and regain control. And so, going back to that word responsibility for action, his first responsibility was to gain control of himself and his health. And so, why not climb the Pyrenees if you're down there? So he climbed the Pyrenees back and forth for 2 or 3 months. And you get a lot of good exercise climbing these 12,000-foot mountains. Eventually, and then he walked through Europe. He got into, he was always interested in the arts. He walked down to Sicily and back to Florence and back into France, and then traveled around. That's a very interesting period in his life. Finally, he said, oh, well, I better get back to school. So he goes back to medical school in 1926. He's sitting down, not particularly interested. I mean, he's had quite a life by now. So going back into medical school and doing all that drudgery work that he left 9 years before wasn't for him. But how about founding a dramatic society, where you can get modern plays and stuff this old Abbey theatre, which is this Anglo-Irish William Butler Yeats and Lady Gregory. Let's get some modern theatre into Ireland. Shake the people up, And so modernism became a theme throughout his life, rather than doing sort of what was called stuffing at the time. He created a dramatic society there, but again, eventually he has to give up. He just can't continue the studies. It comes to the attention of Eamon de Valera, who had a concept that he wanted to create a new newspaper. I referred earlier to the importance of newspapers and how now in America we have at least 2 sides, if not 3 sides, and you know what station you can listen to get a certain attitude. Well, in those days, there was whatever county newspaper there was, it was pro-establishment for the most part. And the editors would have been pro-establishment. So a De Valera's thought was, let's have an anti-establishment newspaper that tells the facts. Whatever happens in the world, or whatever happens around Ireland, let's get the analysis. Well, how do you do that? Well, you need funds. So how about sending my generals, Ernie O'Malley and Frank Aiken, to Newport, Rhode Island, to Boston, so they come over here and they do a 9-month tour of America. They raise about $500,000, and bingo, the Irish press gets funded. And they start doing, it eventually becomes propaganda for the Fianna Fáil party, but certainly all of the Republican cause was included generically over that period. Father travels broadly, he goes to California, and I find in one of the Seattle newspapers when he was giving a lecture one day, and he was terrible at giving lectures, I should say, which is something you might ask me about. I have to cut my time here. I found in this newspaper a saying which he was, remember he was talking to try to get Irish Americans to support a cause. And somehow the interview goes on to be, Irish student studies Seattle University's library system. Excuse me. Anyway, at the very bottom of this long interview, I find this word, which is the key to the rest of my father's life. And he's saying in reply to the question, what you're going to do, he says, my soul lies with the arts, in them lies happiness. I hope to be able to restore Ireland's interest then. If I could, it would be a far greater reward than becoming the most famous surgeon. So bingo, in this one sentence, so to speak, I find the key to the rest of my father's life, which I'll go through fairly quickly. He goes to California, he meets a bunch of people like John Ford and Edward Weston, artists, meets an Irish rebel author, Ella Young, who's a poet and a mystic. And from talking to her, he learned something of the technique of how you write about yourself. And he starts into diaries. Here he is in 1927, a photograph taken by Edward Weston, a distinguished American photographer. He meets somebody in the widow of Peter Golden, who wants to take a 14-year-old to the Grand Canyon, and he finds out that Ella Young is in Taos, New Mexico, and he said, I'll drive you. And when they get to the Grand Canyon, he said, Taos is only this way, about 6 hours, so they drive to Taos. And Mrs. Golden loves Taos and goes back and brings her family to Taos and lives there. And father loves it. It's a very artistic community. Many of the American greats, both in the literary and painting, have passed through Santa Fe and Taos. So he lives there and he writes his book on another man's room. He does poetry. This is the car that he drove. So quite often what he does is, since he has no money as such, not yet on a pension, he is able to offer his services to drive. And later on he offers his services to a lady and her friend to drive to Mexico. So that's the way he actually gets around, because he gets a lift if you're driving, and you go from place to place. But that's the car that drove around. He becomes a poet. He lives from Mexico, from New Mexico, he goes down to Mexico. And that's an interesting situation also. He comes back to New Mexico and spends 2 years there. Paul Strand, another American photographer, happens to spend a couple of months in New Mexico, meets my father, and they became lifelong friends. And this is a Paul Strand photograph. Anyway, by then he needs to decide. He's still loving Ireland, wants to get back to Ireland, and he goes east. He works at the Chicago World's Fair. He's still trying to publish his book. You can see in my archives all of the letters of rejection that he gets. I mean, rejection letters are so sad. I mean, you see 12 in a row come in a 3-year period. He then hears that there is a pension available. Eamon de Valera has been elected. He decides to leave Sinn Féin in 1926. He decides to take the oath, which Father doesn't like. But they get into power. And what the realism of what Collins had done in that decision for making a truce and a treaty, de Valera even, and de Valera was anti-treaty. So de Valera by 1926 has said, this makes no sense. You need to join the system in order to defeat it. And so he leaves Sinn Féin, takes the oath, throws the Bible in the corner after having taken the oath, as sort of a symbolic way of justifying your action. And eventually, 5 years later, becomes the Prime Minister of Ireland. And so with that, the Republicans are now back in charge, so to speak, and they're able to give pensions to their own men. The Free State would only give pensions to Free State officers and men who were then in the Free State Army. And so when de Valera came in, he was able to give pension. You go through an application form, and if you have served and done whatever duty and eligible for pension, you get it. So Father heard about this. In fact, Frank Aiken writes him and said, you know, apply and you should be doing fairly well. And he did get it. He applied and got a very high pension. So the other thing that happened in his life was he met this young lady. This is my mother. She was from a well-to-do family in New York, was an artist, ultimately decides she rejected her establishment family in a certain sense. She didn't want to go to college. She wanted to be a sculptress, and she defied the family and so on and said, give me the money and I'll study in art in New York City. So, and then she traveled through Europe, and again, part of that same money, had a great time. And she was prepared to meet my father, who was interested in the arts and could speak about the arts and had written about the arts and continued to write about the arts. She stuttered, and so she did things which stutterers sometimes do, which is look inward on yourself and do things which you can do best all by yourself, which would be sports. She played tennis, was national junior tennis champion at age 18, and she rejects that. And she goes into sculpture and painting and photography, all single-minded things that you can do. So when Ernie O'Malley comes on the scene, you know, they fall in love and are quite a couple. They decide to get married, to go back to Ireland, and they don't live happily ever after, but they have 3 children. They live in Dublin, and eventually Father publishes his book on an old man's wound, which is a great story of the story that I've told you earlier. But he's sued for libel and loses, and decides to leave Dublin and goes down the west. So they start a whole different life down the country. He goes into folklore, he goes into archaeology, he goes into photography, he goes into local farming. My mother, they rent a house in, this is near Lewisburg, and then near Newport, where I was born. And they want to do a book on Irish archaeological and monastic sites. It never gets done. So the rest of my father's life really is a whole series of things that never get done. And the book I wrote about it is called Broken Landscapes, because everything he touches breaks. The Civil War, the Irish Republic, the marriage, the farm never continues in the way. The book that he never did on photography, the libel suit here's our farm in County Mayo, the trasher, beekeeping. So, during this period, 1939 is the War of Independence, as the Second World War in Ireland is called the Emergency. So De Valera had called neutrality for the Irish, a cause not liked by Irish Americans, nor by the American government, because, who are you for, the Germans or the West? That's another whole topic perhaps you had discussion about, and to see what the Irish role was. Anyway, they were neutral. So they go into self-sufficiency. So my father, who's not a good farmer at all, he tries to run a farm like he ran a brigade. And you can't do that with farmers. Paddy, you're late. It's 9 o'clock. I mean, Jesus, it was a bad noise, I looked at the cow. Are you kidding, General? So they leave in 44, go back to Dublin. He works on James Joyce's Ulysses, makes a concordance of it. He becomes an editor of the Bell magazine. He writes art criticism. Knows Jack Yates, very interested in the art. Writes in Left Coast Leave, the only family photograph we have. And then in 1948, he develops a whole new thing, which is how to tell the story of those who fought. And he goes around and interviews 450 people. Now this is at the time, those of you who might know, the family have been involved in things. There's a Bureau of Military History in Ireland. They had staff and they had people and typewriters and people paid. Father did this, and they got 1,700 interviews. My father, all by himself, with a pen and pencil and copybook, interviewed 450 people over 5 years of his life, basically as he was dying. So, and yet here's another project that failed, because it's only coming to the light now that I've been publishing some of his work. My mother leaves the family setting in 1947-48, returns to America. Some nice highlights. John Ford comes. Father has met him in the 20s in America. He becomes an advisor on the Quiet Man. You don't know about the Quiet Man. Was I in the Quiet Man? Yeah. Someone's in the know. Yeah. So, and Maureen O'Hara. Yeah. But we were redheads. And so when I met Maureen in New York a couple of years ago, she gave me all her photographs of me as a young garçon, as we say in the west of Ireland. And I since there was someone made a reference, Mike made a reference to my wife. Those of you who are married and have spouses, I'm sure you can relate to this story. I said to my wife that I'm going to have going downstairs for breakfast with Maureen O'Hara, and she turned over the bed and went to sleep. So I called her about an hour later and I said, Maureen's about to leave. Do you want to come down and meet Maureen O'Hara? I said, are you kidding me? I said, okay, well look at it this way. I mean, I know you don't believe me in this story, but what do you have to lose? I mean, just put your gown on, come downstairs in the elevator, and come over and have a cup of coffee. No, she came down, but terrible. Anyway, those things happen in life, right? So here I was, here's my, that was taken in that same summer, 1941. Father had terrible health problems, again, one of the disasters in his life. But by 1957, he died in the spring, and the state gives him the 5th ever state funeral. Why? I mean, I've often asked myself, so who got the first 4? Michael Collins, okay, surely. Arthur Griffith, well, surely he was president, and then Collins comes later and he shot, and he gets it. And some archbishop, from whatever, and some papal nuncio. Oh, and there is a 5th, the President of Ireland, who in 1937. And so in 1957, for 20 years, there hasn't been another state funeral. this newly elected Debonair government give the sixth man in the Irish history a state funeral. He has no political position. He's never been officially elected in the modern Ireland in any case. He's a totally unknown person. So when I did my book on No Surrender Here, the Civil War Papers of Ernie O'Malley, I started digging into and see who was in the cabinet in 1957 to make this decision. They were all anti-treaty Republicans, all of whom had actually technically reported to my father because he was his chief of staff. So, I mean, this is the clannishness of Irish society, you know, and here are the three men who made that decision. Eamon de Valera, who was then Taoiseach of Ireland, Sean Lamass, and Frank Aiken, who had been his buddy, got his pension and had traveled to America. So, in conclusion, you know, he was born and raised outside of Dublin, what we in the West would call the Pale. He fought the Pale, namely the establishment, whatever was represented by that. In this case, it happened to be the state, the army, and British Army, and the church. I mean, having been excommunicated, he had a certain attitude toward the church. He came back to the church on his last week in life. He certainly raised me as a Catholic, but he wasn't too happy with the establishment of the church. He was disillusioned that the Irish concept of that the Republicans have, the thinking part of the Republican group in terms of their cultural and political ambitions had never been realized. And basically it failed to achieve all the things that he hoped for. So I would say it's a sad ending because here he died at a very young age of 59. His life was just really in tatters. We got this monument in his name in Castle Bar. Anyway, there we are. So, went over time. I don't know whether the chair will allow any questions. Sure. Yeah.
I'll bring the microphone to you if you have questions.
Just a comment, if I might. That was the most fascinating presentation we've had in any of these series.
To everyone.
And I didn't ask him to say that.
Other questions? Yes, Linda.
I'd like to know if you'll ever see your mother again.
Ah, indeed, good question. So the good mother flies into having divorced my father. I skipped that part. Having come to invited me to dinner one day in September 1955, and my father brings another gentleman along and says to my father's Shelburne Hotel in my presence, "I'd like to marry you again." My father says, "Well, we're not divorced." But quite apart from that, you're just too much for me. And so she turns around and says, "Well, do you mind if I marry him?" That's funny. And so my father congratulates Richard Laura, and they get married the next year. So I'm off in a boarding school in England, and my father dies. My brother and sister, who I skipped over that part, my mother kidnapped my brother and sister, and brought them to America. And so I was sort of living all alone with my father. Anyway, they arrived back in Dublin, and there's a state funeral, meeting at the Russell Hotel. The mothers of Dublin come. Saying, "What should we do with Ernie? Ernie's son?" You know, they've all promised and sworn an oath of allegiance that he'll stay in Ireland and he's not going to go to America and we'll take care of him. Let's be practical. Who's going to take care of him? And when? And how? And where's the money coming from? And how many children do I have? And how about that expensive school he's going to Dublin? So the mother stepped forward and said, I'll take him. And all of them went to Dublin, stay, and I come to America. So she is quite a force in my life. Very dominant lady, quite a character. And she's into the arts, and she's a photographer, and a sculptor, and a poet, and a dress designer, and various other things. And so I lived with, well, apart from her, but to help take care of her, and she only dies in 1993. So I sort of really knew more about her than him, because I never knew my father. I didn't know he was involved in the IRA. Anyway.
Rosemary.
There have been several movies made and television series dealing with the rebellion and Civil War in Ireland. If we went back and looked at some of those programs, would we see Ernie O'Malley as a character?
Has anyone seen Shake Hands with the, not Shake Hands with the, sorry. The Wind That Shakes the Barley. Yeah, it's an incredible, really well-done story. Some blood, more blood than one wants to see. The director sort of said, hell, that's history. They did it. You should see it. And now you can understand. So the young medical doctor in that film would be Ernie O'Malley. It's not a biography, but it's a biographical sketch of an organizer who, and that probably is in the Tipperary area. And you get, the movie brings out in a way a novel can do without being attached to actual facts. The layered society in which people actually live, which is a landlord and servants and the military and the IRA and the volunteers. And the poor fellow in that movie where is caught in a bind and discloses the location of the volunteers. And the leading fellow has to take out that fellow and shoot him. He's an informer. Now, you know, when you live under these circumstances, you're either with us or against us. And there is no excuse, so to speak, from the military perspective. Not we're talking about the human side.
The Informer was an original movie too that dealt with that topic.
Yes, and the Informer, that movie that you referred to was John Wayne. Sorry, John Ford's movie, The Informer, made about 1928 or 29. And in that case, is it Bucko sells out the IRA for £10. I always remember the £10 because it was, and he saw the sign in a drunken fit, sent £10 trip to America. You got your ticket for £10. Anyway, so yeah, that was on the movies. Yes, sir.
If it's not too personal, can you comment on how you think your mother viewed your father's life?
Well, yeah, she always loved him. I mean, you know, that poor Mr. Rollins going up our house in Connecticut every evening after he said goodnight had to walk by a large 3-foot by 4-foot portrait of Ernie O'Malley. Hi, Ernie. She kept a house in Ireland where I was born. She did sculptures in Ireland. So Ernie O'Malley was always part of her life, even though, you know, one has to accept the fact that some couples break up. And this was irreconcilable. But it doesn't mean that the love and the attitude wasn't always there. So, I mean, her poetry is about him. The paintings that she buys are about the west of Ireland. You know, her reconstruct is of him in Ireland. And if anyone goes to Dublin this coming summer between June and October, there'll be an exhibition of paintings called, of her photography. It'll be called Helen Hooker's, Helen Hooker O'Malley's Ireland. And it'll be up for those 5 months in the National Library's National Photographic Archive in the Temple Bar. And she has her photographs from 1935 all the way through 1985. So we have 50 years of Irish photography. And the Irish curators are very excited just to see. So she takes the audience, visitor, into Kilmainham Jail in 1936 when she's there. She's led in by Ernie, and she hears these stories. And in the dark, mooded photographs that she has, you really feel the horror and the screams and the attitudes. Or into Dublin Castle, or down the west. A lot of the photographs that I have are in this book called Western Ways, which is on sale in the back. But it's really it's rural Ireland. And if any of you are non-Dublin people, any other county can relate to the photographs which my mother took. And she took these photographs in 1936, 37, 38 when she was traveling around rural Ireland. Anyway, no, I had a great time living with her. And we're just making a documentary about her too. Yes, ma'am?
I wasn't aware that the Catholic Church excommunicated, was it the IRA soldiers you said?
Yeah, well, you know, look.
I thought that they were for the revolt.
Not really. Look, I mean, I'm not trying to make a religious comment, but I want to take a historical position on the church. So, when Catholic emancipation came in 1829, you don't mind if the odd ad lib here, do you?
It's your stage.
So when Catholic emancipation came, guess what happened to a Protestant British Parliament? You got Catholics sitting with it. Was that a good idea for the church? The British Parliament, now partially influenced by Catholics, was running the world, the then known world. The Catholic Church was very happy with that. They would have been anti anything that would break that connection. They would not be supportive of home rule. They would not be supportive of other natural causes. I don't know how much Rome ever was influencing through its bishops, the Land League and other matters. So the church establishment in Ireland was never nationalist. So, what does nationalism involve when you get involved in the IRA? Well, you have to face it. You're going to kill somebody. Is that a mortal sin? Well, yes. When you join any army, are you asked to kill people? Well, not directly, but indirectly. If you have a gun and you go out and shoot, and you're likely to kill somebody. So, for the church then to take a position that those people who are opposing the British regime in Ireland in favor of nationalism, they're the ones who are killing people, therefore mortal sins, but the British are not. Okay, wait. What is that? Yeah. Run that by me again. So you can exploit pastoral, they're called the pastoral letters. They're easily to research online, and you'll find out that the way they did it is the priest would not give Holy Communion, not give extreme unction, would not hear confessions of people who are about to go out and kill people. Now, there were rebel priests who, unfortunately, the IRA was very Catholic, and these people were, notwithstanding having been excommunicated, it doesn't mean that you don't have your own personal relationship, quite apart from the institution, with the faith which you have been raised in. And so these people, for the most part, remained Catholic, but not institutional Catholics. And some of them came back to the church upon death. So that happened in the Civil War as well as in the Town War. Yes? It's, I must be in between you and the bar, I guess.
Thank you so much. All of the I need to get you down here with Brian and Francis for a little tour.
Well, I know we have one representative, Larry O'Keefe, who's done in our own community of Pocketuck and Stonington. We're starting, as you mentioned, the Irish Presence Committee, and we want to come up and visit the museum this summer. So, Larry, we're up for it, right? We're up for coming back.
Thank you. The variety was phenomenal, and we can thank Ann Arnold May for that. On your way out, please do, as we transition into next fall, regenerate the next series.